You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
For a while, I know that the Guardian's have been doing incredible and important work covering voting rights and elections, and the concerted, organized, comprehensive efforts. You may have also noticed that his appearances on the show have become more frequent as we approach the election.
This Halloween orange pumpkin.
There are so many important questions to answer as you make choices in any election. But once that's done and voting is underway, really only one remains. Will our votes matter? Will we be allowed to vote? Will our votes be counted? Will the results be certified? Will Congress do its ministerial job without interruption this time? Will Americans abide by the results? You know, no one has spent the last, 5 years digging into this as much as Sam, so we're lucky to have him back. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Edwin. Thanks so much for having me again.
Well, the election is now underway. Absentee ballots are in the mail, and that sound you hear is mine. I received mine yesterday, and I will complete it today and get it back. Early voting has begun in some states, but efforts to undermine voting have not slowed down. Do you want to talk about that?
That's right. I mean, people talk about Election Day, but the election is already well underway. And, after the 2020 election, there were significant efforts to curtail specifically mail-in voting, which Americans used in record numbers in 2020. So we saw states do things like shorten the window to request an absentee ballot, shorten the window to return one. So the deadlines are a little bit tighter this year.
Sam, we talked about this, I think just a couple of weeks ago, but Dems have now sued Georgia's state election board. Can you tell us about their case and whether or not it can be resolved in a timely manner?
Well, the Georgia State Election Board, which is an unelected 5-person board in Georgia, has passed through a suite of very aggressive last-minute rule changes. Those changes have included giving local election officials more discretion over whether to certify election results. And most recently, they passed a rule that requires local election workers to hand count ballots at the precinct. They're not actually counting the votes. They're making sure that the number of ballots matches up with the number of ballots that the machine recorded. And Democrats sued them over that this week. Sorry, I think it was last week. Democrats sued them over that last week for a few reasons. First, they said that the board has exceeded its authority. This is a board that is charged with promulgating rules to enforce Georgia statutes, but there's nothing in Georgia law that requires a hand count. So the board has said that it is going. So Democrats have said that the board went far beyond its authority. The second thing is that Democrats say that this is going to create chaos and confusion. It's not going to lead to an orderly election, and the board is charged with promulgating an orderly election. So that lawsuit was just filed last week, and I think we're going to get a fairly quick ruling on that in the courts in Georgia.
Well, that's good news, I think. But so Georgia's a swing state, really important for the outcome of the election. I want to turn for a second to Alabama, which nobody thinks is a swing state. And yet. So folks in Alabama are being told, hey, you're not citizens, you're not allowed to vote. But it turns out that there plenty of citizens are being told that. Will you talk about what's going on in Alabama?
Earlier this summer, the Secretary of State of Alabama sent out a notice to about 3,600 voters saying, we believe you're not a U.S. citizen and that you have to prove your citizenship if you want to vote. The secretary put every voter who is flagged in something called inactive status, which is a very aggressive move. It essentially means that the voter has to take additional steps if they want to vote a regular ballot in November. And civil rights groups, the Justice Department, sued Alabama over this action, saying that it violates a requirement that states can't undertake any systematic action within 90 days of the election to remove voters. And the Justice Department in its filing said that actually a significant number of voters have since contacted the Alabama Secretary of State and said that they are in fact citizens. I think it's something like more than 700 voters, so 700 out of about 3,600. That's an astoundingly high error rate. That means that Alabama was wrong about 1 in 4 people that it flagged on the. Let me say that again. That's an astoundingly high error rate for Alabama. It means that the state was wrong about 1 in 4 voters with the potential to go higher. And, it's just astounding for the state to be asking eligible voters to prove their citizenship in order to vote. The bigger picture is that this effort in Alabama is part of a national effort by Republicans to suggest that there are non-citizens voting in our elections, and this is the consequence of that kind of lie taking root in the states.
Yeah, I was going to go there, and you got ahead of me. So in Alabama, voters up here, citizens up here in the upper Midwest, which is where most of the people listening to the show are, they don't think about Alabama as a swing state. They care that everybody should be allowed to vote, but it comes as a puzzle why the leaders in Alabama would make it harder for people in that state to vote, throwing legitimate voters off the rolls in that state, when really there isn't a single Republican in jeopardy of losing an election in Alabama. And yet they're doing it for the reason that you just started to talk about, which is to lay the groundwork to undermine elections everywhere. And I think you've written a lot about that. So let's talk about that. I can talk about that later, but let's talk about that right now. So it's part of this national effort. Say more about that.
Well, this idea that there are non-citizens voting in election is something that's been disproven and debunked many, many times. Not only is it already illegal, but there have been several studies, investigations that have found that, when it does occur, it's isolated, it's very, very small. And Republicans in recent months have really started leaning into this again, and they've done things like they passed a bill in Congress to require proof of citizenship. It passed the U.S. House, but it's not going to go anywhere in the Senate. President Trump has started saying it on the campaign trail over and over again. Secretaries of State in Alabama and elsewhere have sent out notices to voters and loudly publicized their efforts to say we believe we have non-citizens on the voter rolls, but the methodology that they're using is extremely unreliable. And the Republican National Committee has filed a number of lawsuits in several states accusing officials of not properly policing their voter rolls. So, when you take all that together, it's a very aggressive effort to create this impression that there's something amiss in American elections and that they're vulnerable to non-citizens voting. And this is a strategy that dovetails really strongly with other Republican issues, concerns about the border. And it also comes at a moment when we know that the demographics of the United States are changing significantly. This is a country that is, already on pace to become majority non-white, and there's considerable cultural anxiety about that. all of that combined with, the already escalating rhetoric about voter fraud is all creating this perfect storm for Republicans to seize on this issue. And it seems to be a very, very clear effort to seed doubt about the election, and is something that if Donald Trump loses in November, that I think Republicans are going to return to claim that something was amiss in the election.
Okay. So I guess I'm going to ask you how predicting the future is, I know, a dangerous game. But everything you've seen leads you to this place where you just said, should Donald Trump lose, we should expect him not to accept the results. We should expect them to claim that the vote is illegitimate and that he won. Is that really what you're telling me?
I mean, I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that Donald Trump will accept the results of the election. He's been asked multiple times, including at the debate, and he has refused to say that. J.D. Vance was asked about that at the debate this week, and he took a pass on it. So I really don't see any suggestion that Donald Trump will accept any election result that's not a victory for him.
Yeah. So across the country, local governments are fortifying their election facilities. They're erecting bollards and protections in anticipating post-voting chaos. Do you think this is warranted? Is that a prudent thing to do, or is that overkill?
Well, I think there's good reason for election officials to be doing that. They saw what happened in 2020. I mean, you just looked at the images of ballot counting at the TCF Center in Detroit or at State Farm Arena in Atlanta. We know from a filing from Jack Smith this week that the Trump campaign was encouraging people to be disruptive at the TCF Center in Detroit. And over the last 4 years, election officials have dealt with a wave of threats, harassment, angry people who are upset about the election, and they're taking extraordinary steps to protect their facilities and to protect themselves, anticipating that the same thing is going to happen in 2024. So yes, I do think those are justified steps.
And you just talked about folks being harassed around the country. Are there good examples of that you can tell where election officials are harassed? I think somebody was wearing an Ask Me How to Vote T-shirt and got chased out of a grocery store. Do you know people some examples of that?
Well, there have been, numerous examples, and, there was a story this week in the Christian Science Monitor about an election official in Georgia who was wearing an Ask Me How to Vote T-shirt in the grocery store, and someone came up to her and started harassing her. There have been numerous examples of officials reporting death threats to the Justice Department. And in Lucerne County, Pennsylvania, they just announced that they're going to fortify their election office by putting boulders outside of the office to prevent someone from, driving into the building or something like that. There's just numerous examples over the last 4 years of election officials being harassed. Many have left the profession altogether, and I think that, again, it's something that we're going to see more of this year.
And all of this stems from a pattern and a repeated pattern of lies that are being told to the American people. Lies about non-citizen voting, I guess lies about Asian residents in an Ohio town eating pets. You spent some time talking about what we can do to counter these lies. You wrote about, I guess, the limitations of our defamation laws. What did it cost Fox and Newsmax, or whatever the name of that propaganda organization is, for their lies? How did it stop them? And did the guilty verdicts or the penalties they paid impact the public's view about the truth. Talk about what you found.
Well, after there were a wave of lies after the 2020 election, a number of individuals, voting machine companies, took action through civil litigation, through defamation lawsuits, to hold those that spread the lies accountable. Companies like Dominion Voting Systems, Smartmatic, which is a much smaller voting equipment company, sued Fox, Newsmax, OAN, all networks that played a critical role in spreading this misinformation. And what we've seen is that a number of those lawsuits have settled pre-trial. The Fox Dominion settlement famously resulted in a $787.5 million payout for Dominion. The Newsmax case, it was a case between Newsmax and Smartmatic, settled right before trial with confidential terms. OAN has also settled litigation. They've apologized on air. And this is just one of the ways that people harmed by these lies have tried to seek some measure of accountability. But experts that I've spoken with have really warned against expecting these lawsuits to be a cure-all for misinformation. Libel law is an area of law that's meant to address a very specific issue, which is when one specific person or a company is reputationally harmed by something that someone knew was false. And that can be extremely difficult to prove. In the United States, there are reasons why that's difficult to prove, especially against a news organization. There are important First Amendment issues there. Just because these cases are settling, it isn't going to cure misinformation. And I think a lot of people look at these settlements and actually say, well, it could send the opposite message, that you can actually just get off the hook for lying if you agree to pay a certain amount of money. But what these settlements have done, but what these cases have done is, beyond the settlements, they've provided a look into the internal workings of these companies and have lent public insight into what news personalities and other people knew at the time that they were broadcasting these lies. And especially in the Fox case, it led to revelations that people like Tucker Carlson and other key Fox hosts knew that the information that they were broadcasting about the 2020 election was false. And I think that's very valuable to have in the public record. But I don't think people should expect these cases to convince people about the 2020 election, to change people's minds. But I still think that they're important to have for the public record.
Let me talk about two cases you haven't mentioned because they're slightly different. One was, of course, Rudy Giuliani got sued by two election workers for the damage to their lives that he caused. And he did not prevail in his defense. And yet he has not yet been held. He has not yet felt the effects of the verdicts against him, and he hasn't stopped lying. Talk about that.
Well, this is a really interesting case. So two Georgia election workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, sued Rudy Giuliani for spreading lies about them. They've, detailed publicly the vicious harassment that they faced after the 2020 election, after doing nothing wrong. They were just two, election employees in Fulton County. And last year, a jury in Washington, D.C. ordered Rudy Giuliani to pay nearly $150 million to them in damages. And on the one hand, you might look at that and say, that's a measure of justice, that these people are going to be compensated for the harm that they suffered. But this verdict really hasn't had any effect on Rudy Giuliani. He continued to defame them during the trial. I was there on the courthouse steps when he continued to repeat the lies that he had made about them, literally outside the courthouse as the trial was going on. And after the trial, Giuliani declared bankruptcy and has dragged these two women through bankruptcy proceedings to delay paying them any money. And to this day, he still has not paid out, what he was ordered to pay them. So on the other hand, I think you could look at this case and say it did lead to some level of justice against Rudy Giuliani, but it hasn't really resulted in any consequences for him. So, that continues to play out. The two women are not letting up. Their lawyers who are from Protect Democracy, which is a nonprofit organization that's been very committed to fighting against these election lies. Those lawyers have said that they will go after Rudy Giuliani until the end, ensuring that he cannot escape accountability for his lying. So I think that's something that we're going to see continue to play out over the next year.
One other case, Donald Trump was convicted by a jury of libeling a woman that the judge says he raped. Then he was also found liable for sexual assault. Notwithstanding that finding, notwithstanding that he had to pay, he hasn't yet paid because he's appealing, but that he was fined an incredibly large amount of money, at least to me it seems like a large amount of money, for those libels and for that assault, he continues to repeat the lies. So it goes to the effectiveness of we do not seem to have the tools as a society to stop someone from lying and slandering.
That's right. I think when a lie is out there and when it comes from someone who has a considerable public following, it's very, very difficult to persuade people that it was untrue or that this person lied. And, unless that figure takes some form of accountability, these lies continue to exist. And Donald Trump, of course, has refused to concede anything about the 2020 election. He's refused to concede anything in the E. Jean Carroll case, which is the defamation case you just mentioned. And so his supporters continue to support him. So I think we're really seeing the limits of defamation suits, libel suits, as tools for correcting misinformation.
All right, So just at this point in our conversation, I want to recap the things we've covered because taken together, it's a terrifying story. We said, look, there is an ongoing organized multi-state campaign of lies. And many lies, but one in particular, that the election results can't be trusted because the people who are casting ballots aren't entitled to cast them. Two, that the lies have led to attacks on election workers, to violence, and to laying the groundwork for claims that the election itself doesn't count. Three, that we have every reason to expect Mr. Trump post-election to say the election didn't count and that he is the actual president. Four, that we expect because of his lies that a large part of the public will rally to his side because of those lies. And I guess lastly, we haven't the capacity through courts to stop anybody from telling those lies. That's a pretty grim place, Sam.
It's a very frightening place to be in. I think, the key thing is that the thing that does hold and the thing that absolutely, will result in some accountability and that won't be overturned is the vote itself. And, I think for all of the concerns, about Trump's effort to undermine the vote, there's still a lot of confidence that, the rightful winner of this election is going to be seated as president of the United States in January. And I think, taking a look back at the last 4 years, that, it was always the sense that, the ultimate measure of accountability, wasn't going to come from the courts. It was going to come from the ballot box, and, voters will have their say. As we talked about, they're already voting. The election is the ultimate measure of accountability.
The only measure of accountability, apparently.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to change subjects a little bit. I'm standing here, I'm looking at my ballot, and it is such a privilege. It says to me, it's looking right back at me, and it's saying, look, I'm not just part of a great nation, but I have an obligation to its future. Because when I vote, I'm not just opining about our present circumstances. I'm joining with my neighbors and my fellow citizens to build a future together, to choose a future together. But I hear rhetoric like when Mr. Trump says to evangelicals, you'll never have to vote again. In that rhetoric, I hear a very different idea about democracy. In that view, America is made up of their club and everyone else. And we are in a battle where one side will win and the other side will be destroyed. And for them, that is the only question history poses for America. The only question, will we prevail over everyone else? And when that's solved, well, there's no reason for anybody to vote anymore. Sam, I think that's insane. But I also understand how we got there, the decades of lies. And not just the ones you and I have talked about from Trump, but lies that go way back, whether that's about Hillary Clinton and pizzas or, about the party generally on every divisive social issue, or, my God, from Phyllis Schlafly to Fox Cable to Lee Atwater's shameful use of Willie Horton to Donald Trump saying if he loses, it's the fault of the Jews. This ugly streak is as old as our nation itself, but we've always overcome it. And for me, Sam, overcoming it is the reason why we are an exceptional nation. It defines us as an exceptional nation more than anything else does. But this time, these guys have translated those lies into laws that limit how people can vote. It's like a modern Jim Crow wrapping its long fingers around our electoral system. And so I know I've asked you this before, and I know you just talked about it a minute ago, but I want to go into more detail because now that voting is underway, how do you know, other than faith, that the results will truly affect the will of the people?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. First is that there are laws on the books in every state that make it very clear that, absent concrete proven evidence in a court of law that, the results of the election are going to be certified. The person with the most votes is going to win. And, I think part of this is setting expectations for, potentially a long vote count. Part of this is clarifying what it means when someone files a lawsuit to challenge election results. Those are just allegations. But there is little doubt that any state in the country is going to be able to overturn the valid results of the election. It's just not going to happen. So that I think is something that people should be very, very confident in.
I'm very happy to hear that. But in a really close election, they need all the people who are allowed to vote to be allowed to vote. And we're certainly saying that some people have to take extraordinary efforts to be allowed to vote.
That's right. And I mean, I think, it's harder than it should be in a lot of places to vote. But, I think one thing that's really encouraging is we are seeing people who are engaged, and we are seeing, a high turnout, people come out to vote. So that should give people a little bit of faith too.
Sam, as always, this is really powerful, helpful. Your reporting is so important. And boy, I look forward to talking to you after the election when there wasn't a single disruption and people accepted the results. And we put this in the history book that you will undoubtedly write for generations to read. I'm grateful, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Edwin. Anytime.